Hey, middle schoolers, how are you tonight? It's good to see you guys again. Well, once again, we're going to do our class online, and that's okay. And I know because Sunday was strange for us that some of you didn't get this lesson anyway. So I'm going to spend some time on the lesson. Tonight's lesson is the Tower of Babel. And so we're going to spend some time. Let's kind of review what we talked about last week. Remember last week we talked about Noah, and we talked about the flood. We talked about how he was kind of the original quarantine, if you remember. And we looked at that timeline that you see there, all the way from Adam to Noah, how a lot of these lives overlap. There probably wasn't a need for a written word. They had an oral tradition. Some of you guys are in history classes, and you learn about different ways that people record history. And so it's not until Moses, remember, that we actually start having people write this down. Well, these guys could have just gone back to each other and asked, hey, what was it like? Maybe during this time of quarantine, you can talk to your family about its history. Maybe some of you are quarantined with your parents or maybe even a grandparent, and you can find out a little bit about what life was like when they were younger, maybe when they were in middle school. It's probably changed a whole lot since then. What are some of the things they learned? Where did they go to middle school? What's a teacher that they remember? And so, again, these folks could go back and just ask, what was the story? Well, after Noah, remember, we see the end of humanity as we had known it, but it wasn't really the end, was it? Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's Genesis 5. And so he becomes a dad. He has these 3 sons. Those 3 sons get married, and then all 8 of them, that's Noah, his 3 sons, their wives are going to join the ark. After they build it, animals are aboard, and there's going to be a flood. And you remember, at the end of it, there is a promise. There's a promise that God will take care of us. What I forgot to mention earlier, if you'll look on the page here on the church website under lessons, you can find a packet to go along with this. It's kind of a worksheet. It does have puzzles and games, as many of you guys like. And if you want to print that off, it should be like right, whoop, I can't do the camera right over there on the church website for you to get that off of. And so if you'll do that, that will be fantastic. All right, that being said, and God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So they were on the ark, remember, over a year. It just rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but they were there much longer. And then Genesis 10 lets us know these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations and their nations, and for the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. So from these 8 people, they will continue on to have families and children, and they will spread out across the way. Now, some of you are in 6th grade and you have ancient history, and so I thought I would just spend a little time on that for a minute. Ham is going to be told that he's going to serve the world and his brothers, and we're going to see where they go and see if that's true. Shem would excel at spiritual things, and it's through Shem is the rest of the story. So it's Shem's family that we continue to follow through the Bible. We eventually get to Abraham, and then we follow Abraham's family, and then we follow parts of that all the way down to Jesus. And Japheth would show prosperity and peace and would be there with Shem. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. I want you to look at that. 350 years after that. So they had this major event, but Noah got to see the world come back alive. He got to see people replenish the earth. He got to see plants come back, the animals come back. So God was showing him that while, yes, there was destruction, God is still a God of growth and of creativity and a promise. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So when Noah dies, there are now hundreds of people on the earth, as you can imagine. And so Genesis 9 tells us about his life. Now, who are these people? Well, here are where some of them go eventually. I know some of you, again, are studying things in 6th and 7th grade history, and so I want to spend some time on that. The Shemites become the Semites. You may have heard of something called anti-Semitism, somebody who is against the Jews. Well, that's kind of where it comes from. It's a little bit of a mispronunciation there. But the Jews, the Muslims, the Zoroastrians, those that believe in a monotheistic God come from Shem. And again, we've already been told that's how part of that happens. Remember, they were going to be the spiritual ones. The Japhites actually eventually become the roots of the Greeks and the Romans and the Europeans. They migrate that direction. And the Hamites become the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and Orientals and Africans. And sure enough, they will end up serving as we will often see. Now, here you can see that the story goes on with each of these. These men had their own sons, and then again, you can see where they wind up, kind of a family tree here. And if you want to spend some more time on that in Genesis 10. Here's where they go. And so this is the Mediterranean. Many of you are familiar with this in your ancient history classes. Egypt there at the top, in this general area here where you can see that little pyramid. And here eventually will be Italy and Greece. Over here are the Babylonians. Again, you can make your way to Asia. So when the ark rests in the mountains of Ararat, not Mount Ararat, but the mountains of Ararat, they were able to spread out throughout this area. And so you can see Ham, you can see Shem, and you'll see Japheth, and their families begin to spread out, just like your family may be spread out. Maybe you ought to ask your parents, where is all my family today? You may have cousins and second and third cousins in places you never imagined. Well, let's get to tonight's lesson. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. It's not a lot of verses, so go ahead and open your Bible. You can do that in paper version or online, and I hope that you've been able to get to that worksheet. It's okay if you didn't get to print it off. Maybe you'll just follow along at a different time looking at it. Maybe you just want to play the recording later and look at it. I do want to say on behalf of Chris Glover and myself, we do miss you guys tonight, and we're looking forward to when we can be back together as a class. Chris was supposed to teach some of these lessons, and I know that he had already put some time and effort into that, but I thought it was just easier for me to put these online. Maybe we'll get Mr. Chris on here. I'm just trying to keep that social distancing thing, but again, hopefully we'll come back together. All right, Genesis 11, here we go. Let's talk about the Tower of Babel. I'm going to show you some art tonight. Many of these are painted way later than the event, obviously. Many of them during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, so be careful when you look at these. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but I like to put these out here so that you just kind of have a visual. It helps me to realize that this was a very large construction project, but many of the people in the picture, if you notice, look a lot more from the Greek and Roman times, not really the times of the tower. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Some of you may be taking a foreign language. Maybe at the school you go to, they teach some Spanish or some French or maybe Chinese or even something like coding on computers today. We often forget that there are still areas of the world today that speak very limited languages. Tracy and I are going to go to Budapest, Hungary. Hungary is a country of about 10 million, 11 million people. The only people who speak Hungarian is Hungarians. But then think about languages like Chinese, over 1 billion people, or English today. If you're going to be an air traffic controller, or you're going to be an airplane pilot, wherever you are in the world, you have to learn English, because that is the language that they all communicate in towers and airplanes all over the world, so they have a common language. You can see how important that would be. You're very blessed. You live in a country where you can drive for hours and hours and hours, and you have people who speak English. Now, again, they may have some different words or have a different accent, but generally you can understand what people are saying. That is not true everywhere in the world. But imagine the whole world speaking the same language. Remember, they'd come from the same people. They had the same story. Hebrew is one of the oldest recorded languages. It is given to the people. They are able to use it and write down their stories and, again, to pass that on. So what was God's purpose really after the flood? It really was to continue to spread mankind. And really there only was one language at this point. Why would there need to be more? They were all going to be worshipers of God. They were all connected through family, and God wanted that connection to occur. The problem is, and I think you're going to see in the story, that God had to change that. So, where is this area? Well, this is a modern map, and many of you, again, are studying history in your classes. There's Baghdad. You've probably heard of that on the map. In modern-day Iraq, you can see the Mediterranean Sea over there to the left. We think it's somewhere in this area. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, so again, they've left the mountains of Ararat, and found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So again, not surprised, they moved out of the mountains, they go down to the plains. You can see there's a river there. There will probably be floodplains to help with their agriculture, and so this makes sense for an area for them to travel to. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Again, they're baking clay. You've talked about this in classes. You know that baked clay is pottery. It's what people are carrying their water in, all the things of that time period. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. So again, they're sticking these bricks together. This isn't a dry stack. They're going to put this together, and you know tar is a very sticky substance. And so they're going to make sure they make this thing, and they know they're going to make it go high and that it will last. Now, one of the disadvantages of this is that you can only build so high. Eventually, as you have the weight at the top, it will crush the weight at the bottom, those first few rows of bricks. So what's the idea? Lay out a very broad base and then slowly work your way up in kind of a pyramidal type shape, right? They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven." Now think about it, they're on a plane. What better advertising than when people come into this area and they look far into the distance and they see this tower, they go, "Oh, there's a city over there." I mean, think about how we do that today with like skyscrapers or lights as you drive into Nashville. Maybe a billboard, right? Well, that's what this would be. In the Middle Ages, you'll see people building buildings for churches. And they will put those tall steeples on it, or those spires, and the biggest building in town will be one of those medieval cathedrals. Again, people could see that for miles and miles and miles. They knew there was a town there. And so what do they want? Well, they want people to come, just like we want people to come to our towns, right? And trade and stay and bring goods and buy our stuff. So they build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. So what do they want? Hey, you ever heard of Babel? Yeah, it's got that big tower. I mean, think about things like Paris. What do you think about? The Eiffel Tower. Or New York City, the Statue of Liberty. People have a name or maybe a landmark. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. You got to remember, these guys do not have Google Maps. They do not have GPS. They could wander off and literally not be able to find their way home. I know that's kind of hard for us to believe today, but let me go ahead and tell you, since I'm a history guy, right? In the Middle Ages, if you wandered off from your town more than 50 miles, probably no one knew how to tell you to get home. There weren't maps, there weren't road signs, you didn't know where you are, so this is going to kind of be like a beacon, and they're really afraid that as they spread out that they will forget where they came from. Maybe you've been hiking in the woods before. I went to the Great Smoky Mountains several years ago, and I kind of got lost. Trees start looking the same. I couldn't tell if I was really still on the path, right? And so again, how do you find your way back? Well, you've got this huge landmark. So here's an artist impression of what we today would call a ziggurat, right? Not the pyramids like in Egypt, but again, we need to remember ancient people were building big stuff. I think sometimes when we think ancient, we think like small, or they live in caves or little towns. But again, they're using the same labor. If we took all this time that we were quarantined and started stacking concrete blocks, imagine how many concrete blocks you could stack in a day if that's all you did all day long. And if you've got hundreds of people doing that, it doesn't take long, right? Well, they're making the bricks, they're stacking the bricks. They've got to have a way up there. And again, this would be a monumental structure. People would come into this town and then go to their town and say, "Oh, you've got to go to Babel one day and see it." Maybe there are things you want to see. Maybe some of them are natural, like the Grand Canyon, or maybe some of them are things like you want to go see the Washington Monument somewhere. So here is a reassembled ziggurat. Okay, this is in those areas that we're talking about today, and they have a stairway. Remember, it's this idea that that's like a gateway to heaven. Remember, there's going to be a story later about a man named Jacob who sees angels running up and down a ladder, right, as a gateway to heaven. But this would have been very formidable to think, hey, what's up there at the top? What's it like at the very top? Remember, most of these people are going to live in maybe 1, 2, 3-story buildings. Maybe you've been in a tall building. It'd be cool to know. What's the tallest building you've ever been to? What did you get to see? Maybe you've been up to the top of the Great Smoky Mountains, Klingman's Dome, and looked out, miles into the distance. So that's what you would have been able to see. Think about it on a plane again. If you went to the top, you would see forever. I got to go to a Mayan pyramid once, and I did. I climbed all the way to the top. I probably should have put that picture in here. And you could just see for miles across Mexico because it's very flat. So you could see the next town. You could probably put a fire up there, and people would be able to see it, kind of like a lighthouse. So, here again is a reconstruction of the tower in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Again, we see this associated with other temples in the Bible. But again, it's a monumental structure meant to stand out. That's what they were trying to do. I thought I'd throw this joke in here for you. Ha ha ha. I know, it's corny. It's okay. This Tower of Babel is even more current than you might think. Saddam Hussein, some of you have heard about him and things that have gone on with the Gulf War. He had hoped to rebuild it as a symbol of who he was in the world he lived in. And so it's on Iraqi currency. You can see it there. They're a little bit different artist interpretation of it. Kind of goes up in like maybe a cake. Again, we see ziggurats in lots of cultures. Mesopotamia, some of you guys are studying them. They come after this. Here is a ziggurat at Ur. That's where Abraham's from. Remember, Abraham's from Ur of the Chaldees. We still have what to us would probably look like a hill, but archaeologists have realized that no, it's actually the foundation of a ziggurat. This is in modern Iraq, and the upper levels have been destroyed by rain, erosion, and probably people took the clay bricks off and built other things with them. That's not uncommon. We even see that happening in medieval times where people take the stuff away. Here is a step pyramid in Egypt. I know a lot of times when we think of Egypt, we think of like the pyramid that we see, but those are much later. The first ones they built were like this. They were step pyramids. And again, they're able to stack those bricks on top of each other, but they're getting a little smaller as they go up, so there's not as much weight on there. Remember, if they'd gone straight up, the weight would have been so much it would have crushed those bottom layers. We see the Mayans. Some of you guys have studied these. Those of you maybe even who are at the end of your 7th grade study or 8th grade, beginning of 8th grade study, remember when the explorers got here. They would have seen these. These would have been very impressive for them to come to the New World and see these structures. Maybe some of you have been to Mexico or Belize or will go on a cruise or something. I'd encourage you to go see them. They're very fascinating, and some of them you can still climb up, and like I said, you go up and you can just see for miles around. It's a flat. We still use it in modern architecture today. This is a government building out in California. It's called the Ziggurat building. It's still built in that style. And here is the California Department of General Services. Yeah, this isn't something out of the ancient world. This is a building right there in West Sacramento that you could go and look. It's right there on the river. It looks something like out of the ancient world, right? But it's a modern office building. So, what was the purpose? Well, again, they wanted to remain centralized. They wanted to have an urban center. They wanted the town. And they really want to build a monument to man and maybe his spirituality to reach to the heavens. Look at what man can do. So, let's look at verse 3. And you can take this if you want to look in your Bible. Look at how many times they refer to themselves in this. I think it's very important. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Who's it about? It's about them. And guys, I know in this current situation, maybe you're like down because you're having to be at home and you miss your classmates and your teachers. And yeah, it's going to get a little boring, but sometimes it isn't about us. It's about helping out other people. So you can see there that they're very concerned about themselves, right, and about the us. I hope you're concerned about other people during this time period. I hope you realize that one of the reasons we're having to stay home is we do have older populations. We're not sure who is susceptible to this and how fast it could spread. And so we're actually having to sacrifice a little bit. Well, these people aren't interested in sacrificing. They want it to be about them. And I know sometime in middle school, we think it's all about us. Even as adults, we think sometimes it's all about us. We have to remember that there's a bigger world out there, and an even bigger God. So, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So God comes to see, right? The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language." And this is what they began to do. So of all the things they could have done, they decided to build a tower. What else could they have done? Well, they could have researched medical issues. They could have helped the poor. They could have done a lot of things. And this is what they begin to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. I think that's an important verse. I think it says when man gets together and puts their mind to something, they can accomplish great things. In the book of Acts, remember the early church, it said they went out and they preached to all the known parts of the world, that they turned the world upside down. I think sometimes as a middle schooler, maybe you forget the power that if you got a bunch of middle schoolers together and you started thinking about how to solve world problems, what you could do. If you started thinking about how to make our church better, what you could do. How to make our youth group better, what you could do. I think it really says once we get our mindset on things that God says, I put men here so that they can think and work through things and figure things out. The problem is sometimes we think about ourselves, not about the bigger picture, right? We're thinking about, oh, how big I can make something for me, like my wealth or my physical body or something like that, not what can I give to other people. Come, let us go down. Did you see that? Remember our Genesis study? Give me a minute. Let us go down and there confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So this thing they thought they were going to build that was going to be so cool that everybody was going to talk about, yeah, people probably talked about it. They probably said, hey, look at that thing that never got finished. Yeah, never got finished. Maybe some of you are getting to finish some projects you started a long time ago. Remember, we talked about the let us. What is the let us? Well, remember, it's the Godhead. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, angelic created beings. So again, it's kind of a field trip to come down to earth. It won't be the only time they come down to earth, right? Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So basically, they no longer could communicate. Maybe you've tried to talk to somebody in another language. I know Tracy and I, in some of our travels, we have been places, and we've had to ask people, like, where's a good place to eat? Or we got lost one time in this little town in Italy, and we were trying to find this other area, and we walked into a cathedral, and there was a lady there who was kind of the tour guide, but it was a small town, and she did not speak any English, and so we were trying to ask where was a good place to eat a certain kind of food, and, you know, we eventually got to where we're going. I'm not sure we followed her directions exactly. There was another time in France, we got off the train, and we went to this little town, little cafe. The menu is totally in French, and Tracy's trying to order something, and we are just able to kind of guess what we're ordering, and the toppings that are going to come on the pizza that we had ordered. But again, it was an adventure, but it would have made it hard to communicate long term. You're probably glad that you can understand the people that you work with on a regular basis. But God's going to do this. He's going to scatter them. I think also that idea of the pyramid or that ziggurat goes with them. And we find most cultures building something like that. I mean, think of the Incas and the Mayas. Look at the Ethiopians. Look at the Chinese even. This idea of this pyramidal type structure, I think, has a common root. I think it's in the story of Babel. Now, this is just kind of a cool thing. I know some of you haven't had ELA all week, and so I thought I would just throw this out there. I think sometimes we forget that the Bible has literature in it. We think of it as a history book, but it also has literature. And here is where you take the literature and you really break it down. So notice that the story kind of has some parallels. You know, maybe you've read a story before and you're looking for the high point of the story. You're looking for where all the action gets resolved, right? Sometimes we call it the climax of the story. It says all the earth had one language. All right? Notice when it ends, they have confused language. Do you see the parallels there? Notice it says they spoke one to another, and then they had one to another. They were going to make bricks, but what God did was make confusion for them. You can see that the story kind of goes down and parallels itself to the very center of the story, verse 5, and it's that God came down. That's the climax of the story. Here's this story, and it's building to this point, and then God comes in and does something in the story, and then it kind of goes a different direction. Okay? So I want you to look at that, and I want you to see that many times when we look at literature in the Bible, it follows the literature you studied at school. And so for your ELA lesson today, I just want you to see this parallel structure of a story. Maybe you've read a story like this or a poem like this where it starts out with something and works its way in and then works its way back out on a theme. So there it is. Now, just for fun, you can turn it sideways, boom, and you have a ziggurat. All right? I don't think that's exactly how it probably was to be in the Bible, but I just think it's kind of fun to look at that way when you walk the story through the story. All right, so what's some of our lessons? Well, language started with Adam. Everybody spoke the same language. Made it very easy to build the ark, right? But it's going to get confused at Babel. And then we have to be able to teach the gospel in languages. And so at Pentecost, everyone heard in their own language. If you remember when the fire descended, the Holy Spirit there on those apostles, and they were able to teach, and people said, oh, I'm hearing in my own language. Well, today, the Bible's translated into lots of languages. That might be a fun thing to do. Get on Google and look at a Bible from a different country. See if you recognize any of the words. See what it looks like. And don't just pick like French but pick Russian. What does a Russian Bible look like? What does an Arabic Bible look like? What does a Chinese Bible look like? Kind of think about that. Maybe some of you will use your language skills one day to help with those folks. So, here is something that I show my AP Euro students. It's a painting by Peter Bruegel, which is just painted later to show the Tower of Babel. People have always still been interested in the story. Notice this is painted 1563. That's 1,500 plus years after Christ, and people are still painting that story because it's so interesting to them. This is a modern story. This is the European Union. Some of you may have been familiar with it. You may have heard things like Brexit and how Britain is leaving the European Union. Some of you haven't studied a lot of modern European history yet, but you may. But what's kind of cool is if you look at this building, when they built it in honor of the Tower of Babel. Now, it's not a ziggurat, but it does have levels, and it kind of has this unfinished thing at the top, right? Like probably the tower would have been when people walked away from it. But if you take these two, this painting and this building, it purposely was built. You can kind of merge them there. And the European Union was a way of, instead of having people divided across Europe, to bring them back together. And maybe they won't have a common language, but some common governmental ideas. So I thought that was kind of cool. I didn't know that about the building, or that this building and the story was still something that in Europe people are thinking about as they put together a new governmental system, right? So just kind of a neat thing. A little history, a little ELA, and I hope a lot of Bible tonight. Well, that's our lesson. I'm going to try maybe next week to do a little Jeopardy or something like that. We've had a couple of lessons. So you may want to go back and relook at the Noah story. You may want to look at the Tower of Babel. We might have one more lesson before we go into Jeopardy, but I know you guys like to do that for review. I just want you to know that I do miss you guys, and I hope that you're watching these and staying up on your Bible studies. Feel free to share one of these with a friend. Maybe you and a friend want to have a Bible study together. Maybe you want to watch it with not just your family, but maybe you watch it remotely. And you and a friend watch it together, kind of talk on the phone as things come up. You can always pause it and talk about it, or look at a slide in more detail. And you can always contact me. If you have questions, let me know. I know, again, a lot of you are probably going to get to that point where you're going to start getting bored in a few weeks. And I'll try to put some more things up here just for fun for our middle school. Parents, I appreciate you continuing to make sure your kids are getting a good Bible background in these times. And hope you guys have a great evening. And hopefully we'll be together soon. I know that's what I'm looking forward to. And looking forward to just hanging out again. Check on here. There'll be some things for Sunday. Hope your family had a great worship last Sunday. Maybe that's the first time you just worshiped in a small group like that with your family. But that's how some people worship all over the world. Mainly because maybe there's a small group of Christians, or because of persecution. So again, it just kind of reminds us how cool it is that God lets us come together on Sundays and be His people. Have a blessed evening. Everybody at Old Union, love you guys, and hang in there. We're going to get through this. God bless.